Hi everyone, just going to wait a couple of minutes to let a few people come in. Brilliant. Grand, there's a few attendee list is slowly increasing, so I'll just wait a couple of minutes and we'll get started. Brilliant. All right, well, I think we'll make a start because we've got some brilliant speakers and I want to make sure that we've got plenty of time for to hear from all of them. So a few people are starting to come in to the webinar, but I'll just introduce myself and why we're here. So my name's Ren Piercy. I am the Local Action Officer for Sustainable Food Places, based at Sustain, which is the Alliance for Food and Farming. We are hosting this webinar today as a bit of an overview for food partnerships and local enterprise partnerships to kind of learn a bit more about each other. But most notably to understand basically how local enterprise partnerships and food partnerships can work together to support and build the local sustainable food economy. So it's great to have you all on the webinar. There's still a few people coming in, but just housekeeping. I know we've all done a million Zoom webinars now, so I'm sure everyone's really up to date on what to do, but we've got the Q&A chat function, so it should be just the bottom of your screen. So if you've got questions you want to ask throughout the webinar, there'll be two opportunities for you to ask those questions, one kind of halfway through and one at the end of the webinar. But you can pose those questions all the way through the webinar. So I encourage you to use that function as you're going through, pop your questions in. And then we've got the chat function, which I really encourage you to use to introduce yourself, share what you're doing, where you're from, and also kind of you can pop in useful links for other people. We'll be doing that. We'll be popping things throughout this webinar that Sustainable Food Places and beyond are up to, so we'll be popping things there. This webinar will be recorded, so don't worry about having to take any frantic notes. We will give you the recording and useful resources and also the timings of the webinar. So that will come in your inbox hopefully today or tomorrow. But I think that's probably all housekeeping. The agenda should be on your screen now, but we will be running, I'll introduce our speakers in a minute. So basically, by the end of this session, I'm hoping we'll have a bit of a better understanding on what local enterprise partnerships are, what food partnerships are, and where those access points are for both networks to work together to build towards a more sustainable food system. This is a relatively new area of work for Sustainable Food Places. Many food partnerships are just beginning to engage their local enterprise partnerships. So if anything, it's kind of more of an introductory webinar where we hope to give a bit of an overview and a taster of potential collaboration opportunities. But for those of you who don't know who Sustainable Food Places are, Elise, can I put the next slide on? We are a food partnerships are from towns, cities, boroughs, districts, counties across the UK. And they are organisations with representation from local authority, public sector, third sector, business and academic institutions who are driving innovation and best practices on all aspects of healthy and sustainable food. Currently, there are around 50 active food partnerships across the country, and sustainable food partnerships work across 6 areas of focus, exploring things like nature-friendly food systems, reducing food poverty, building good food movements, good food governance, and building a more sustainable food economy. It's an award-based membership system, and our food partnerships are really driving the change in the food system at the local level. So if you're interested in finding out more, I'll pop the website in the chat. And there are newsletters and things you can sign up for to hear more about what we're up to. So I'm not going to dwell on the COVID emergency too much. I'm sure everyone's a bit saddened to hear the news this weekend. I guess it was quite inevitable. But in light of COVID, it's really worth highlighting how the crisis has exposed how fragile our food supply chain is. But not only that, but how important sort of localized food economies are, and how they've really shown themselves up in their ability to adapt and prove their resilience in these times of crisis. So it feels like a really important moment to support and develop these localized food economies and to work toward a more sustainable food system that supports people and the planet. Just really ensuring that food and farming at the heart of sort of the economic recovery as we move forward, living with COVID. And this is why it feels like a really important moment to engage with local enterprise partnerships who are at the forefront of this recovery. So today we'll be hearing from 4 people. Ben Reynolds, who is the Deputy CEO of Sustain. We're hearing from Jamie Izzard, who's the Deputy Senior Responsible Officer for the London LEP. Nigel Curry, who is the founder of the Lincolnshire Food Partnership, and Gareth Roberts, who is the coordination lead for ShefFood, which is the Sheffield's food partnership. So before I hand over to Ben, just got to mention that my colleagues Elisa and Leon are in the background looking at the Q&As in the chat. So if you want to direct message them with questions, feel free to do that, but they will be looking at the Q&A and the chat. So before I pass over to Ben, Sustain have actually just published a report last week looking at how local enterprise partnerships can put better food and farming at the heart of the economic recovery. So I will pass over to Ben to discuss more about this.
Thanks a lot, Ren. I will try and keep this short because I think the other speakers are much better versed in this than I am. As you said, Ren, this is a new area for Sustain and for many of the food partnerships in the network, many on this call. So I want to start with a bit of an apology, bad habit, I know, to those of you who are much better versed in both of these, those LEPs present who we're going to hear from, who are already working on good food, and those food partnerships who have long been working with those local enterprise partnerships. Ren gave a good introduction to what our concept is of a food partnership for those joining us who are perhaps not familiar with this model. And I will attempt to reflect to those food partnerships joining this call about LEPs, their importance and their role in the context of a focus on a good food economy. I've been given this slot partly to shut me up, as I've been urging colleagues on the need for sustainable food places to focus in on this for so long. So huge thanks to Ren, Leon and Elisa for setting this up. If you could change the slide, please. The other main reason, as Ren said, is to cover this report, which we put out last week. Before I begin, I just wanted to do a little poll to run whilst I'm talking. I think Ren is going to share that poll. So if you could answer this whilst I am talking, hopefully by the time I'm finished, we can see the results of that poll. So for those attendees not initiated with local enterprise partnerships and why they are or could be relevant to local food economies, here's a bit of, just wanted to give a bit of background. So LEPs was set up in England in 2011 as a vehicle to support local growth, replacing some of the functions of regional development agencies. They were intended to promote a business-led and more locally responsive agenda. And since then, the role and remits of LEPs have grown, as have the amount of government funding that goes through LEPs. They were originally intended to solve various problems, including leading private sector-led growth and job creation in their geographical area. LEPs typically focus on delivering better infrastructure to stimulate economic growth through investment in roads, housing, innovation, skills, training and job creation in those local areas. If you can go on to the next slide. So there are about 40 LEPs covering the whole of England, with some similar structures for economic development in the devolved nations. Ooh, I think I've lost the slide. I must have added in one later. I was going to show a map of LEPs of the country, but you can find it through the wonders of Google. As I said, there are about 40 LEPs covering the whole of England. Some of them, some local areas have more than one LEP in the area. I clearly didn't add that picture. Use your imagination. British Isles carved up. Well, actually, it's England. I think this is the key thing. So LEPs are a feature within England. In the 12 nations, they have some similar structures for economic development. So in 2017, the government announced that after the UK leaves the EU, a UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be created. And this would replace the millions of pounds of EU funding, which I suppose went to the EU, came back to the UK. So replace funding streams such as the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF, the European Social Fund, the ESF, amongst other funds, other EU structural funds. As much of the funding that LEPs channel from the EU, LEPs are likely to be key in delivering this UK Shared Prosperity Fund. However, it still hasn't been firmed up and finalised. There's a few other big things that have got in the way in the last few months. But it is likely that that UK Shared Prosperity Fund will be funding money for local development projects across England, and with some other money going through other similar structures in the devolved nations. So it could, if given the right direction, affect the way in which the food and farming sector develops. Obviously, the replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy through ELMS will have a huge impact on what we farm, how we farm, but that is not likely to cover much beyond the farm gate, which is where LEPs, where the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, maybe other funds would come in. So the need to stimulate an economic recovery in response to the impact of coronavirus has seen LEPs play a very prominent role in government plans, with a £900 million investment in July 2020 going through LEPs, with some of that support including stuff going to food enterprises intended to stimulate a green recovery. So there is, potentially a good basis there. So yeah, LEPs could help deliver better food and farming across the country. They also have a responsibility for enterprise zones. So the first of these enterprise zones were established in 2012, with more created in subsequent years. And then in 2015, LEPs were invited by DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, to bid for food enterprise zone status. And this led to 11 food enterprise zones being hosted by LEPs, focusing in on food and agriculture. So LEPs' ability to harness the huge potential of the food economy to deliver multiple sustainable social, economic, health and environmental benefits should be acknowledged. And we would hope that it would go beyond just those 11 food enterprise zones. And this is as much a challenge to the food and farming sector and to local food partnerships to work with those LEPs to help demonstrate those benefits by developing proposals together and working together. So this report, or the previous picture report, goes into much more detail into these different funds, these different initiatives, the history and context and case studies. Even now, though, it's becoming out of date as more of those LEPs and food partnerships are exploring these links. So this is always the problem with any reports. They come out of date the second that you publish them. Before I hand back to Ren to introduce the next speaker, I just wanted to flag this government report on your screen, which is I suppose, is a bit more of an overview of this new strand of work at Sustain, which is looking at the food economy and specifically how good food and farming can play a role in the economic recovery and leads to more, better jobs and livelihoods. So this particular slide, this cover, this shows a report that we released back in September, which it's safe to say really just scratches the surface on some of the great ideas out there that, given the right investment, the right policy support, could help create jobs and livelihoods, and do so in a way that's good for nature and the environment, health, our communities. So this includes ideas on things like eco-feed, which is something backed by Feedback and a number of other organisations, which I suppose is a 21st century take on an age-old tradition to use food waste for animal feed. Other ideas in there around investment in agroecology, agroforestry, horticulture and peri-urban farming, investing in a booster certification schemes to meet a growing market abroad and domestically, partly through higher procurement standard requirements. there are other calls in there for better data collection on UK fisheries to underpin demonstrating its sustainability as a step towards these standards. And some of the other ideas in this report include calls for policy changes to help support a growth in small bakeries producing real bread and the jobs that could lead from that, or investment in an expansion of street markets, farmers markets, other types of markets as flexible spaces to support startups and small businesses, alongside support for the infrastructure for some of those shorter supply chains. And finally, one of the other ideas in there is around innovation and investment in a modernised Meals on Wheels service, providing a valuable strand of social care that would create dispersed employment around the UK. So, I'd say do take a read of it. This is something that we're going to be coming back to in Sustain's annual conference at the end of November, to look at in more detail at some of those ideas. And I believe that the kind of economic recovery we should be encouraging has to come and can only really come through local level initiatives. Whilst the ideas that I've listed through in many cases need that national coherence, maybe national policy support, they'll only really be made real by through local areas and by the partnerships on this call. So I'd like to thank you and hand over to Ren for the results of that poll. Oh, and I just saw, can you repeat the document I was talking about? So it was this report, Putting Good Food Jobs at the Heart of the Economic Recovery. If someone hasn't already put a link to that report in the chat box, I will share it. And when we share the slides and recordings from this webinar, we'll also send a link around to that conference, which is going to be due at the end of November. We haven't yet put the link up, still waiting to confirm a couple of speakers. But yeah, over to you, Ren, for the results of the poll. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. That's great. And yeah, I will send all those reports through, and they should be in the chat too. So I'm just going to share these results from the poll. Most people from this webinar don't quite fit the categories, but we've got a few partnerships on here with who want to work with their LEP, a few who are already working with their LEP, and we've got also LEPs already working with food partnerships. So that is a nice spread. But I'm going to pass on now to Jamie Izzard, who is going to provide some brilliant knowledge about from the LEPs themselves. Jamie is the Deputy Senior Responsible Officer for the London LEP, which is the London Enterprise Partnership, and he's been doing some brilliant stuff with the London Growth Hub, which I'm sure he'll be telling you about now. So I'll pass over to Jamie.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Can you see my screen in presentation mode?
If you share from the beginning, if you press play.
Here we go.
There you go. Brilliant.
Right. Right. Yeah, thanks, guys. So I head up the London LEP, and as you'll see from the following slides, in London it's slightly different from most other LEPs, but not massively dissimilar from the others that are covered by Mayoral Combined Authority areas. I'm based at City Hall, so I'm part of the GLA, and probably the reason why I'm here today is that I used to head up the food team at City Hall as well, so familiar with Sustain, and I've worked really closely with you guys before. But today we're talking about LEPs. So London's Local Enterprise Partnership, as Ben mentioned earlier, it's one of 38 LEPs across the country, across England. In London, our LEP is a non-incorporated advisory body established by the mayor, so it's not a separate legal entity in any way. All of the LEPs outside of Mayoral Combined Authority areas are now required to be set up as independent legal entities. They're all companies with their own boards, etc. But where there is a Mayoral Combined Authority already, that's not required. So that's where we are in London with the GLA. It provides strategic advice and endorsement to the mayor, but actually all of our money comes to the GLA as our accountable body. And all LEPs have to do that. It's a strange thing. Although they're set up as companies, when government give money to LEPs, it always goes to a local authority who's kind of the banker for that funding. And then it's drawn down by the LEP. So it does apply to all of them. But we are an advisory body as a London LEP, and we advise the mayor, and the mayor makes the final decision on any funding. So our purpose in London, so the purpose of the LEAP board is to support the development of the Mayor's economic development strategy. So we support the Mayor's strategy. Other LEPs will have their own strategy if they're not part of an MCA area, but we work together with the Mayor on that EDS. We also work together with the Mayor on the local industrial strategy for London, and that's something that was due to be published back in March and never happened. So some LEPs have published their list documents, we're one of the ones that haven't yet. And government have told us that local industrial strategies remain really important. A lot of work's been done to pull together a really strong evidence base for each of those 38 areas. And we want to put more work into that to make sure it's a kind of economic recovery plan. And that we hope will be a key part of our work programme over the next year or so. We identify and lead on specific priorities for economic development in London. For us, the big part of that is London's growth hub, which I'll talk about in more detail later. We advise on the funding streams that are allocated. So we have a significant capital fund that runs up until the end of this financial year in terms of allocation. And so that's in the hundreds of millions, and that's mainly capital funds that I'll talk about again in a moment. We oversee the London Royal Docks Enterprise Zone. So that's an area where the LEP retains all new business rates that are created within that area. So it's a pretty huge area, the Royal Docks, Albert Docks, Silvertown Quays, etc. Lots of new businesses plan to open up in that area. So any business rates that's created from those new businesses comes to the LEP, and the LEP then allocates it for the benefit of London as a whole, or specifically for that enterprise zone or the wider area. So we've committed to invest about £300 million. These are big figures, 300 million into the Royal Docks and the wider area. And that covers everything from infrastructure through to skills and employment projects. And that's all delivered, really closely with Newham. We oversee the current European Structural Investment Funds programme. So that £650 million programme of ERDF and ESF. We provide strategic direction for those funds. And obviously we're coming to the end of that now. And of course, LEPs provide this really strong business-led voice opposite government. Government want to hear from LEPs. They want to hear from the business leaders. LEPs are partnerships. They include local authorities. They include the likes of the GLA in London. They include HE and FE, but the majority of the members from business. So they're individuals from business or they represent business bodies. And that's a really important voice that government want to hear. I'll talk a bit more in detail about the funding streams that we've had to date, because some of these are particularly relevant to your work. So Skills for Londoners, less so maybe, that's £111 million that we've been investing over the last 3 or 4 years in London's, not just the FE estate, but it's further education providers. It's not just colleges, it can go to private providers as well. And this has been literally the only money that's gone into that sector in terms of capital funds. So we've done a lot of rebuilding of colleges, a lot of state rationalisation, and a lot of those projects are ongoing. We're also investing some money at the moment in COVID response. So, the adaptations that colleges and providers need to make sure their estate's fit for purpose. Good Growth Fund is probably the most interesting bit historically for you guys. So we've had 3 rounds of the Good Growth Fund. It's a big pot, it's nearly £70 million. And we have had some really significant food related projects. So Mission Kitchen at the Food Exchange in New Covent Garden Market, that's about £3 million that let put into that facility, which is shared kitchen facilities and food business startup space that's ongoing. We put in about £500,000 to the Lion Road pop-up restaurant square in Harrow, and we are funding Nourish Hub in Hammersmith, which I think was an old post office that's been converted into a food hub there. So lots of really exciting food projects that have been funded through the Good Growth Fund. Crowdfund London is another one, and this is a bit more unusual because they're not straightforward economic development projects. A lot of these are community-led projects. There's all sorts of things in here. But one worth mentioning was about £12,000 that the Mayor put in from LEAP funds to match crowdfunding in Lambeth for Vote Go Van Go, which was a not-for-profit vegan cafe providing opportunities for people with learning disabilities. So real range of community projects and lots of food projects within that mix. Final section, which I thought would be particularly relevant, is growth hubs. So in London, we've decided to change the name of our growth hub. It's now called the London Business Hub. But growth hubs operate within each LEP area. So again, there are 38 growth hubs. And the idea of growth hubs is to be a kind of one-shop stop for business supports. Some LEPs have used their growth hubs to focus on high growth businesses, so it'll only be kind of scale up support. For London, we focused mainly on everyday economy, actually, everyday businesses. So there's a lot of food business support in there as well. But they do vary, but it's a real priority for government. So it's one to really keep an eye on in terms of how we can support food businesses. And when we say businesses, obviously that includes social enterprises as well. So the London Business Hub relaunched last month. We've got a brand new website, which is a kind of signposting portal. But we also have physical hubs where we provide support to businesses normally on a face-to-face basis. So we've opened 5 hubs, and then places like co-working spaces, libraries, where businesses can come in and speak to one of our advisors. As well as that kind of first line support, so you can have a one-to-one conversation. We normally have a program of events that's now obviously all webinar based, but there's a whole range of events based on different programs that we have. If I just skip forward, so there's our business advisors. You see the sites. I'll share the slides with Ren, so these can be handed out. But you can see the sites where we based the business hub: Vauxhall, Hammersmith, Woolwich, Croydon, and Tottenham. And as well as that face-to-face support, we have a whole range of programs that we're delivering, some more relevant to others, but picking out a couple here. Property advice service, this is a really important one. It's a free service that we've developed as the London LEP, which will help businesses negotiate their first lease. So what we're finding is a lot of businesses taking on their first space really don't understand the full costs involved, from business rates to the way rents might increase. So it's just giving them a bit more information and guidance when they take on that first responsibility of having their own space. But then it also supports businesses that already have a space and they may be in negotiation with their landlord or looking to move on. We've done a lot of work with businesses and arches, for example, a lot of Network Rail or arch co-tenants, where they've had some rent reviews and things like that that have been a big impact. So a big focus on that. It's a free service, so one really worth mentioning to food businesses within your networks. Step Up Startup is a targeted program we've developed with using ESF funding to help underrepresented groups start their own business. So really focusing on BAME women and disabled entrepreneurs. And then also the Step Up element, which is working with SMEs to help them support their female, in particular, but female BAME and disabled staff to move into leadership positions. It's a bit of a pilot project there, but a really interesting one. For more established businesses, we've recently launched the Recover and Grow programs. It's a COVID response piece of activity. Businesses need to have a turnover of around 500k and be employing between 10 and 50 staff. So it's the higher end of our kind of support offer. But a really exciting one, and one business will go on to get an MBA scholarship, and it's in a partnership with CAS Business School. Peer Networks is a really interesting one. So these are happening across the country. It's a national program, but delivered by growth hubs. And what we're doing is we're working with, in London, with I think 25 different cohorts of businesses where we use a facilitator, so use action learning, get about 10 businesses in the room and help them come up with conclusions to business issues that they're experiencing, and working with each other and a facilitator to overcome those issues and build a network that supports them on an ongoing basis. So we'll facilitate 18 hours of support, and then after that, we hope that those networks remain. But it's really interesting because what we're doing, we're partnering with local grassroots organisations to deliver this programme. So we've got 17 different organisations that are delivering this on our behalf. Things like BIDS, but there's faith organisations, real community level organisations that we partnered with. So it's a bit of a pilot. It's happening till the end of this year, and we think Bays are particularly keen, our sponsoring department, particularly keen to extend this depending on how successful it is. We're giving out some money at the moment. It's not much. We've got £1.6 million of grants to give out to small businesses. We've allocated about half of that, and we're going to go out for another call. So it's worth noting if there's any businesses you think may be interested in getting their hands on a grant. As I say, it's a bit of a lottery because there's so little funding in there, but it's grants between £1,000 and £5,000, and we'll be launching that in about a week's time again, and details of that will be published tomorrow. So I just wanted to flag that one as an opportunity. And that's it really. So I said lots and I've said it very fast, but I'm really happy to take questions about how LEPs operate. I can see from the poll there's not really any other LEPs on the call, maybe a couple of others. So from a LEP network perspective, I meet with all of the CEOs from LEPs across the country on a regular basis. So happy to sort of answer any questions about how LEPs operate more generally.
Brilliant, that's amazing, Jamie, for a fountain of knowledge. Really interesting what's going on with the London LEP. I guess from doing a bit of reading around, it feels like the London LEP, it seems to be a bit more visible than other LEPs. So I just wanted to see, is this something that's will be happening, it's kind of murmuring across the country, or is the London LEP, it's just more visible? Has it got more access to resources and funding?
I don't think so. I think there's two kind of strands of LEPs. You've got the ones where they're more obvious kind of economic boundaries. So they match a mayoral combined authority area or a city, and it's much easier for them to align with local government and the regional government structures. I think where LEPs are by themselves, they're kind of the only show in town. So, I mean, as London, we don't have a role in terms of transport, for example, because TfL exists. We didn't inherit any of the functions of the old RDAs. TfL exists. So LEPs in some areas are actually a much bigger show because they are the the key partnership and the only kind of input into central government policy and funding. But obviously the scale is very different for London. So the amount of RDF and ESF funding we have, for example, and our local growth fund monies, which I talked about for good growth and all that, are bigger scale. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. So just thinking for food partnerships across the country, would you recommend kind of entry points for engaging with their LEPs? Is these growth hubs, are they a space where there's kind of where food partnerships might be able to engage and work with LEPs?
Yeah, definitely. So there are obviously 38 growth hubs. We do actually have like clusters of growth hubs, which is quite a useful thing to know. So there are 10 growth hub clusters. So for London leads the kind of southeast cluster, and we all meet with bays it's like a weekly basis. And we have lots of different organisations come in and talk to the growth hubs about work that they're doing or about partnership opportunities. So it'd be a really good opportunity maybe for you to come in and talk to the growth hubs in that way. And I'm happy to organise those meetings. Growth hubs in terms of the business facing stuff, absolutely. But I think local industrial strategies, work that's happening now, the devolution white papers due out in February, we think now. So that is where we will form the kind of UK Shared Prosperity Fund offer. We'll know a bit more about what's happening with the LEPs then. So I've certainly suggest engaging with the LEP Network, which is an organisation very small but represents LEPs nationally, and with the CEOs of individual LEPs. Yeah. Brilliant.
That's really useful. And where we've got a few questions coming through. One question from Sophia is when LEP crosses over several local authorities, how is money allocated to the local authorities?
Well, yeah, good question. So it depends on the LEP. So if a LEP has an allocation of, let's say, £50 million, it may be that it's allocated by project. So they may decide there's a really big regeneration project in one local authority, so they'll get a larger share. I mean, in London, what we tend to do, where there's funding available, it goes out via open bidding rounds. So all local authorities can bid in, but alongside private sector partners, anyone can bid into our funding. And I think the percentage that local authorities get has actually gone down quite significantly. So we'd look at London, we've got bids across London, and we would assess them in terms of how strong the bid was, but we would also look at the geographic spread. But it's not a matter of giving a certain amount to every local authority, not in our area.
Interesting. That's really useful to know. We've got a question coming through about the green agenda, and does the LEPs have what's the LEPs green agenda, and is food within that green agenda? Like quite a broad question.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, so if we look at things like local industrial strategies, they will have a sectoral focus. So we will look at what sectors each area sees as their strength. So each LEP area would identify their top priorities in terms of sectors. And obviously green infrastructure, green economy would often be a very big part of that. It's a big part for London. I think there's a wider fairness agenda, which I think captures a lot of the food activity, the community-led initiatives and social enterprise initiatives. And I think government are keen to see that in terms of the recovery work. But as a sector, yeah, absolutely, green economy would be a big priority for many of them through their local industrial strategies.
Yeah, that's really useful to know. And in terms of working with organisations, businesses that are really pushing the green agenda, is that something that the LEPs would prioritise in terms of who they give money to, if they've got strong kind of sustainability and green goals and aims?
That's another good question. I mean, in London, yes, absolutely. And I think, where there's clear political alignment and that's a priority, you're going to see that more often. But it will depend on the LEP. This is, it's very much down to the LEP how they assess proposals as they come forward, what they would see as their local priorities. So we all have to adhere to a kind of national framework. It's the LEP assurance framework that we have to adhere to in terms of how we assess bids, transparency, and all of that. But it's very much down to the local area, each LEP area, to assess whether that's a priority for them.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, hopefully that's something their food partnerships can help push that agenda a bit further. I just wanted to check if any of the panelists have any questions for Jamie. I think Ben might have one.
Yeah, sorry, I was struggling to use the Q&A function. But yeah, I had a question for Jamie. It was a really good presentation, by the way. But yeah, I was just wondering, a lot of the opportunities you talked about were, I think, fantastic opportunities for many enterprises out there, and the support provided. It seems quite responsive. So it'd be a case of waiting and seeing what opportunities arise, and then seeing if they're applicable. I was thinking from a food partnership point of view, is there an opportunity, do you think, I mean, I appreciate you can maybe only speak from your LEP's point of view, but maybe from what you know, whether this would apply elsewhere, but having that more sort of proactive relationship. So LEPs, food partnerships approaching LEPs and actually co-designing programs of support for food enterprises, and whether you think there might be an opportunity for food partnerships to go to those partnerships with proposals with food businesses already there that they brought together, or whether, I'm not sure if that's how you feel that LEPs work, and whether that more proactive approach is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's appropriate. It will vary, the kind of response you get would vary LEP by LEP. I think it's one thing is important to note. RDAs were huge organisations with massive staffing resource. So I think the entire cost of the LEP network is less than like one RDA was, So they're all generally pretty under-resourced in terms of capacity. So what I would, your best route in is to try and build those relationships with growth hubs and with the LEPs. So often it's worth doing both, because the growth hubs sometimes are outsourced as well. So they may be run by a chamber, for example. So it's worth going through both routes, and I'm more than happy to help in terms of how you sort of connect them with the LEP network. It's a good way to reach out to all of the LEPs. But yeah, I think looking at what their strategic priorities are primarily and seeing how you can support those. So look at the local industrial strategies that have been published. And prior to that, everyone had strategic economic plans. So every LEP will have one published on their website, and see how the food sector can support those priorities. In terms of delivery of specific programs and specific reports, then I think, looking at the growth hubs and how that might apply. I mean, growth hubs are evolving, so they have been, up to now, BEIS have been quite hands-off in terms of who gets supported by growth hubs. So you will find a lot of them have just focused in on those high growth businesses. And I think that's likely to change under a future funding landscape, where BEIS will be more prescriptive, that we need to cover a range of business types rather than just picking winners as such, to be crude. So there'll be more of an opportunity to do that. But the funding's fairly limited, and what we really need is an understanding of what UK SPF is going to be like, whether that does come to LEPs. So at the moment, we get our core grant for London, given the size of it, is about 500k for the London Growth Hub. All right, so it doesn't go far. We've got some additional funding this year, and what every LEP has done previously is get their hands on ERDF funding and other match funding. But ERDF has been the biggest, help for LEPs. So once we know what UK SPF looks like, if LEPs have all of the RDF funding in their area, you have a much better way of approaching business support, in my view, that if you've got it all of that pot in the same area, and you can make sure it's much better joined up and strategically planned. But we need a multi-year funding settlement from government to do that, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen this year.
Brilliant, thanks Jamie. We've got quite a few questions coming through, so I'm just going to, as we need to move on soon, I'm going to pick out a couple and come back to a few at the end. But there's been a couple of people who have highlighted the issues at the moment of food poverty and food inequality, and in terms of, especially with the hospitality industry being really hit hard by COVID, and community organisations having to kind of support with food poverty. Is this an area where LEPs will be investing in? Is this or something that LEPs would be focusing on? I know you've talked about potentially move away from big business, but is this an area where you think there would be investment in terms of food?
In terms of, well, look, hospitality is, you know, the number one thing we talk about as a LEP network at the moment, you know, and the impact that that's had, that COVID has had on that particular sector. So it's a very high priority in terms of the government lobbying and the policy position across the LEP network. And I think absolutely, I think there's going to be a need for a greater focus from future LEP funding streams to support those sectors. I mean, but look, you know, the scale of the problem is not something LEPs are ever going to be able to solve. You know, everything we do is fairly small scale. You know, in London, we put money into certain aspects of hospitality, for example, you know, in terms of emergency funding. But these are small amounts of funding. This is a national government level issue, I think, can only be addressed with the financial clout that they would have.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. Jamie, that's so useful. It's been great, definitely from sustainable food place perspective, but hopefully also for the attendees on the webinar. There's still a bunch of questions, but I'd like to move on to our next speakers, because hopefully some of these questions will be answered. There's quite a few questions coming through about the agricultural sector, the food and farming sector, regenerative farming, hard to say. So I'm hoping Nigel might have a few insights into this. So thanks so much, Jamie. We'll come back at the end for some more questions, but I'd like to move on to Nigel Curry, who is the founder and co-chair of the Lincolnshire Food Partnership, and also a founding professor at the Countryside and Community Research Institute and a visiting professor at the University of Lincoln. So he's very busy. Nigel's going to give us a bit of an overview of what's been happening in Lincolnshire with their LEP. So I will pass on to Nigel. Nigel, you might need to unmute.
There we are. Lovely. Good. Thank you very much. I've only really got 8 points to make, but this is more by way of a personal witness statement than anything particularly analytical. And it's from the other end of the telescope that Jamie has spoken about, because this is how one particular food partnership has tried to engage with the LEP. And it's also different from Jamie's assessment, because we're from a rural or Shire county two-tier local authority framework, which can be quite confusing in terms of access to government. But what I would say to start with is it's blindingly obvious from that first point in my overhead. It's not an overhead, but you know what I mean. It's important to engage with the local authority sector. Well, we all do that as food partnerships, but I think what's critical about that is thinking quite subtly about how you do it. And we used to be the Lincoln Food Partnership till earlier this summer. We're now the Lincolnshire Food Partnership for good reason. And that's because a lot of the things that we are interested in tend to take place at the county level. So our agriculture and horticulture links to DEFRA take place at a county level. Our health and wellbeing strategy is at the county level. Our local enterprise partnership is administered out of the county. And I understand from the County Council's network report of this summer, two-tier authorities are probably going to disappear very soon. to be replaced by single-tier county scale authorities. So counties seem like good authorities to back. So we're now the Lincolnshire Food Partnership, so that we can interface or face the local authority sector as appropriately as possible. And the other point I would make under that is then, if you can make sure you've got as many or an appropriate number of local authority representatives on the Food Partnership Board, that's very helpful in terms of getting the Food Partnership known within the local authority language, if you like. We've got a very good rep from the County Health and Wellbeing Service, and a very good rep from 2 districts, 1 person, but serving 2 districts across the poverty portfolio. So just giving careful thought as to how that interface takes place with the Food Partnership and the local authority sector is a good first point, I think, on the journey to engaging with LEPs, but not just LEPs, because of course, as a food partnership, we tend to see ourselves as a local place-based rather than sector-based organisation, which means we've got to interface with a number of things simultaneously. Develop a knowledge of local funding. Again, that goes without saying, and Jamie sort of whizzed through what to the uninitiated would be a bewildering array of funding opportunities. And it's in a sense trying to make sense of those for us as a community organisation rather than part of the growth economy. And that's quite tricky because a lot of funding goes to the growth economy and the nature of business and training in that. We're trying to do something slightly different and yet serve the needs or serve the requirements of the LEPs. So we tend to focus our aim in terms of local funding on the language of economic regeneration and the language of poverty. So whilst we're doing different things, and I'll come on to give some examples of those in a minute, we tend to use those languages because the language of food per se tends not to work terribly well in a shire county, and the LEP does have an agriculture and horticulture committee, but there's very little link between a food partnership and the big business, as it is in Lancashire or in Lincolnshire, of food. And so we're working our way around that by getting involved in different portfolios within the local authority sector, but also obviously within the LEP. I've also put down there, as a food partnership, get involved with other local organisations, because this place-based embeddedness is quite important in terms of the influences de facto that tend to be made by getting involved with other bodies. So we have within the members of the Food Partnership, people who sit on the County Health and Wellbeing Board. There are 2 of them. We've got 1 person on the Lincoln City Climate Commission. We have, as a number of us, produced a county social economy strategy, and we're on that group, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And also, if you can, join the LEP. Now, Jamie will forgive me here if I just give a brief story of how we joined the LEP. And that is because it's growth sector business facing, small community organisations aren't going to find it that easy to get into the LEP. Now, there's a requirement to have a certain number of community or social economy organisations as members of the LEP company, and we are that, certainly, but if I'm honest, that doesn't confer much power or influence. It's more of a procedural thing. We managed to get representation on our LEP ESIF committee, European Social Investment Fund committee, rather than the Agriculture and Horticulture committee, on the basis of food as a community product. But we had to do that in a sense through a back door. We got a lot of the documentation from the EU about the requirements of LEPs in response to leader funding, which is part of the ESIF portfolio. And lo and behold, we found a route there that required a certain amount of community organisation involvement with the leader programme to get on the board. So we got on the ESIF committee just in time to see all the ESIF funding disappear. But the position is important, even if the money eluded us from that point of view. So if we can move on to the second slide, I just really wanted to exemplify some of the things that we have been engaging with or trying to engage with through this infrastructure. Jamie mentioned the COVID funding in our county, and this is through the County Council Community section. We are allocating the COVID DEFRA funding on behalf of the county, We've got 823,000 to allocate. And that's largely because as a county organisation, many and increasingly in number of our county food banks, of which we have 40, are members of the Lincolnshire Food Partnership, and therefore we're an obvious conduit for putting that money through. So although that's not LEP funding, it's part of that awareness of what funding is coming into the local authority sector. The next area, which won't pertain to all of you, and particularly in the more affluent parts of the country, but there is a thing called the Towns Fund. Again, if you haven't heard it, that's kind of makes my point about trying to keep your eye on what's going on with funding streams from government. This is a regeneration fund for particular parts of the country that have, I think, deprivation indices higher than the national average. And 4 towns in Lincolnshire have got access to this fund, and we've been nominated in that fund for 2 funding streams. Firstly, £175,000 to open a membership supermarket, which is an infrastructure for food banks working together, and £130,000 for a rather curious project called the Feeding Tariff, where we're using this money to put solar panels on public buildings and using all the revenue from those solar panels to provide revenue streams for food banks. Now, that money hasn't been allocated yet, but it's been accepted into the Lincoln City bid to go to Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government for approval. But you'll see there that those 2 funding pots are justified on the arguments of, firstly, food poverty in terms of the COVID funding, and secondly, economic regeneration. So neither of those funding pots or the justifications for applying to them are to do with food per se, they're to do with the infrastructure into which food fits. Coming now directly to the LEP, being on the ESIF committee, we were aware that the Shared Prosperity Fund, although as Ben and Jenny both said, we don't know the detail of it, our LEP put together what's called a pipeline fund. In other words, put in a bid as if the Shared Prosperity Fund were available, so that if it does come live, we'll have some idea of the priorities we want to spend our money on. And we put in a bid as a food partnership for the Shared Prosperity Fund, which was actually characterised as one of the strongest bids in the call. And I say that not to blow our trumpet, but to show you the kinds of things that the Shared Prosperity Fund, if it's a successor to ESIF, it might be less part of the growth economy than other pots of funding, the kind of things that the Shared Prosperity Fund might like. And this had 3 elements to it. Firstly, Edible Lincoln, which is a programme of shifting the Lincoln City Flower Festival to being an entirely edible festival. And that's now got the approval of our town centre management company. The second area is what we've called Educating for Food Taste, which is to roll out our national lead food school, Washingborough Academy, into a further 50 schools in the county. And then finally tackling food waste and food poverty, which is about food banks and the redirection of surplus foods in the county, being an agricultural county. But again, all of those arguments are not to do with food per se. The Edible Lincoln is about growing tourism, a food city and a food county. The education stuff is about childhood obesity, that's the health agenda. And the tackling food waste stuff is about zero carbon and improving the health of the workforce. So again, it's quite messy in terms of the way you work your way through these things, but that now seems to be the kind of funding that LEPs under the Shared Prosperity Fund may be able to fund. And the final thing I've put down there is that we've got funding from the county again to develop a social economy strategy for the county. This was something a number of us wanted to do in the food partnership because it was quite hard working around growth economy industrial strategies to see how food partnerships as community organisations fitted. We thought, wouldn't it be great if there was a social economy strategy in the county that we could kind of champion too? And that's been quite an encouraging process in that the county have liked it, but more particularly a number of LEPs, and Jamie will know more about this than me, are beginning to pay increasing lip service to the social economy. I think probably the lead is Yorkshire LEP, which is championing the circular economy and has projects like Circular Malt. And in other words, they're working towards place-based zero carbon circular economies and that kind of stuff. And I think future funding streams, if not the shared prosperity specifically, will be more favourably disposed to the zero carbon social economy systems view of place-based planning than perhaps the growth economy sectoral view that currently is dominant. There we are.
Wow, brilliant. So many questions, and it sounds like you've done some great investigative work to keep your eye on the ball in terms of what funding's coming through, but amazing stuff happening in Lincoln, and the Edible Lincoln Festival sounds brilliant. I'd like to go to that. But I'm going to move on quickly to Gareth, so we have time to bring in the questions in at the end. So if Gareth is joining us from a polytunnel in Sheffield somewhere. Gareth is the co-leader for the ShefFood, which is the Sheffield's food partnership, but he also is the co-founder of Regather, which is a co-op fruit and veg scheme and community hub. So he's very involved in the food scene up in Sheffield, and hopefully will provide some insights into what's happening in Sheffield and around.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Ren. It's been fantastic hearing from the previous speakers two really different perspectives on working with LEPs or working as a LEP and linking in with the food sector. Yeah, as Ren mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Regather, established in 2010. We're a community benefit society. We operate a fruit and vegetable box scheme, which we're just about to tip the 700 household per week mark. We've doubled in size in the past 6 months as a result of the disruption of COVID on the food system, and yeah, so we're kind of experiencing that disruption firsthand. We also operate a 15-acre market garden and agroforestry development, which actually is in northeast Derbyshire, not Sheffield, by about a mile or so, which for us gives us a really interesting perspective on just how relevant these administrative boundaries are when it comes to linking in with the relevant city regions and the LEPs, because that geography has actually defined our experience quite profoundly. So, our agricultural or horticultural, in this case, business operation is in northeast Derbyshire, but actually our physical base and our kind of food hub, which is where we do all the packing and distribution of the fruit and veg boxes, is in Sheffield. So yeah, we cross over not only the different city region boundaries, but we also move from essentially agricultural greenbelt conservation area land over the Sheffield Ring Road and into the local authority predominantly urban area, particularly in our case of Sheffield. So we've done all sorts of things as well with supporting startup food businesses. Over the years, we've offered kitchen facilities for hire and food business incubation, and really interesting to hear from London in terms of the particular functions. Obviously, we're operating on a completely different scale, and we're resourced in a totally different way. But in terms of the actual function that Regather has offered to the local food economy and the sector, actually we're very similar. We've offered facilities for startup food businesses to transition from home into other workplaces, and we've offered business support. But all of that has been done under our sort of independent revenue generating model as opposed to funding. Now then, our engagement with the food partnership is primarily motivated about a passion for good food, obviously, but it's also in recognition of the kind of strategic work that we felt was necessary in order to start positioning not just Regather, but all of the food partners as part of the sustainable food system and a vision for a sustainable food system in Sheffield. Nigel's points about engaging with local authorities are absolutely spot on. Really important to kind of engage in a whole range of different ways, and we've certainly done what we can over the years to do that, working with city region level institutions, whether that's the LEP, the Chamber of Commerce, both universities, and looking at funding opportunities. But it's all about the scale of activity, and for us, an important kind of factor has been understanding exactly what our expectations should be of a LEP. there's no point, I think, from experience, going to a LEP or a city region expecting something that actually they're maybe not even set up to do. And it's about understanding the purpose of the LEP, and particularly in the context of the region, exactly what their priorities are, because every LEP, every city region is totally different. And in South Yorkshire, which is the Sheffield city region, there's been a whole process of devolution that has taken time and has had to be worked through at a local authority level. But we do now have a devolution deal, and primarily that is for Sheffield, Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster. And obviously the priorities in South Yorkshire define that agenda. So, there are some significant opportunities for us around the net zero agenda, issues around addressing health and social inequalities. But there's also some challenges, which is kind of shaping the perception of the food sector as something much more than food manufacturing and food processing, where essentially the type of work in a kind of GDP, productivity, positive economic impact is really challenging. These are not necessarily high wage, high skilled jobs, and they may not be exactly what a LEP who is pursuing a growth agenda is looking for in terms of an overall economic strategy. Now, that said, we're doing a huge amount of work. I'm just going to quickly walk around. So I want to give you guys who are on the call today a quick view. So this is the Moss Valley. So this is where we are today. And so this is northeast Derbyshire, and you've got a great south-facing slope going down to the Moss, which is a watercourse at the bottom of that valley. And this whole south-facing slope is absolutely prime horticultural land, but not all of it is currently, farmed or cultivated horticulturally. But we do have there's a little cluster of horticultural growers, and it's this type of opportunity that we feel needs support because this is a different good food economy. This isn't factory jobs producing high fat, salt, sugar foods that are primarily for supermarkets and other food outlets like that. This is good quality food that people can reconnect with the food system and enjoy eating healthily and affordably as well. So it's just about changing the food story, and I think that's something that we're really engaged in. And I know there's a number of people on the call today involved in the work, because it's not just Sheffield. We're linking up with food partnerships in Barnsley and in Doncaster and Rotherham, and exploring how we're not a county. We don't have a two-tier arrangement here with local government. We have 4 separate local authorities. We do have the Sheffield City Region and a Mayor's Combined Authority and our City Region Mayor with Dan Jarvis. So it's a different configuration of local authorities and obviously a very different kind of makeup of food sector businesses, particularly say compared to Lincolnshire. Because South Yorkshire, we're good at making big lumps of metal, but we're good at making lots of things actually, but we're not Lincolnshire or Gloucestershire or Herefordshire. This is not an primarily agricultural economy by any stretch. So we have to approach things differently. But this is where that's our first polytunnel. There's Bryn and Doug. We're building polytunnels before the winter and before Doug goes on paternity leave, which happens to be next week. So field report. Hope that's been interesting, and no death by Zoom today.
Brilliant, thanks Gareth. I think we're all quite jealous that you're in a field and we're stuck behind our computer screens. It's really interesting that both you and Nigel have talked about kind of framing food in relation to other things, so climate, public health, which also Jamie touched on. So, but also that you need to be kind of locally minded. It's very each LEP sounds like it's working very differently in terms of especially the food landscape. So I guess in that sense, it's hard to explain what a LEP is, as it's kind of an umbrella term for lots of different, the way it works is really different. In terms of moving on, we've got about 10 minutes, so I'd like to get on with some questions, if that's all right. There's a few that I'd like to come back to, because I think you might all have a perspective on. And for anyone that's got any other questions, pop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and my elves will feed them to me. But there's one that's really interesting about looking at, let me just find it, future economic models. We've got a question asking, have you been looking at future economic models which aren't business as usual economic growth, such as donut economics models, which are designed for responding to converging climate and ecological and public health crises for future generations? I think, Nigel, you touched upon this. I wonder if you have any comments about looking at different economic models.
I think now that we've researched the social economy strategy for Lincolnshire, there seems to be quite almost an exponential head of steam in the notion of social economies to guide economic change. And probably one of the more progressive is there's a national social economy strategy for Scotland, as well as actually for Spain and one or two other European countries. But that's clearly putting social economies at the core of the economic strategy of the country. I think regions in England have got the potential to do that. I mentioned Yorkshire's been pretty well ahead, at least in looking at the notion of zero carbon circular economy kind of models, not necessarily running to those wholesale, but to take into account some of the elements of those, some of the characteristics, and doing that with a degree of awareness of different kinds of approaches. For example, in our social economy strategy, we discussed the possibility of universal basic income, which was absolutely derided by most Western economies up until probably a couple of months ago. And even national government now is talking about, what does a universal basic income mean? Now that's a horrendously different, a hugely different economic model than the growth economy. But actually, universal basic income provides huge numbers of opportunities for community food, because once people have got universal basic incomes, they've got the opportunity to indulge in different kinds of things. And that's what we're attempting to do. We've got a farmer in Lincolnshire, for example, who's deliberately growing in his market garden as many different winter vegetables as he can to give to his local food bank, to inform people using the food bank of what different local foods and seasonality are all about. And that's all part of that educating away from, if you like, growth economies to social economies. And I think there's a lot of potential for that to develop over the next year or so.
Brilliant, thanks. Gareth, you've got a comment you'd like to make?
Yeah, thanks, Ren. Yeah, just to pick up on this sort of question around alternative economic models. So we made a conscious effort to explore the sort of community wealth building approach, and did that right from the beginning, where we formed Regather, and essentially, the food sector for us, out of all of the available economic sectors, the kind of foundation economic sectors, as they're sometimes called, offered the best opportunity to demonstrate how, from a community wealth building perspective, a particular sector of the economy does offer significant opportunities. Now, it could have been banking, it could have been housing, it could have been social and healthcare provision. All of these sectors offer opportunities for alternative economic models that essentially challenge how it is that wealth in mainstream kind of conventional business terms is extracted out of local economies at various points in the existing systems. Now, obviously, in the food system, that predominantly happens in the supermarkets. So, better food trading, short food supply chains, forms of agriculture and horticulture that look at ecological impact as a sort of primary criteria for success. These are all examples of different ways of doing things. But you've got to hardwire these things into the business model, and and it is important that people are able to make livings whilst also addressing the issues that alternative forms of business and enterprise do set out to achieve. And I feel like it's like we're trying to do something very difficult. Capitalism is failing to achieve address these issues. We're doing something that's very difficult. We're also going about doing something differently. This is not the mainstream. We are flying in the face of the status quo, and unfortunately, because of that, we've got to do it well. This is where quality has to be set very clearly, because often when it fails, unfortunately, the finger is pointed at doing things differently, and the alternatives are seen as being problematic when actually they're perfectly reasonable ways of going about doing things. It's just often they're either not resourced well enough, they're not supported, the policy environment isn't there. And I feel like now, particularly with COVID, there is a fundamental realization, a reappraisal of how it is things could be done differently in a way that actually is a very positive way of responding to the challenges that we are facing. And I think as a result, these alternative approaches are increasingly not the alternative. They are really the only choice that's available to us. Now, it's about raising our game as small food sector operators. It's about connecting with the institutions, whether they're LEPs or city region bodies or anchor institutions like universities. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's easy to say, but it's really difficult to do. But this whole approach, this conversation, these sorts of events, the county-wide approach, for us, it's a really positive sign that we're seeing, organisations like Sustainable Food Places, raising the game, taking the agenda forward in a way that as it has happened so far, hasn't quite got to where it's at. But we've got to meet these folks, somewhere in the middle, and that's I think that's a really important step we've all got to take.
Brilliant, thanks, Gareth. That was brilliant. I wonder if you got any comments, Jamie, if you'd like to say anything.
No, nothing much really. I mean, just the good growth agenda is what we've been talking about since the current London LEP's been in place. So everything that we do is about good inclusive growth, which is a massive change from how a city like London has developed something like an economic development strategy that is based on it being fair. So it's a really good, interesting thing to see, and I'm seeing that trend across LEPs. Absolutely, it's definitely the direction of travel, and more so now post-COVID. And programs like in London, we have things like Advanced London, which is a business support program for circular economy. Sits outside the LEP's work, but it's ERDF funded. There's lots and lots going on, and it's definitely a national trend. Yeah.
Brilliant. This all sounds very positive on all three parts. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm not sure whether it's worth delving into the questions. I don't think we'll do it justice. I just wanted to see if Ben or Leon had any final comments before we close the webinar.
I suppose a final comment is actually a question as well, which might be something that Jamie can raise. And we were talking about alternative economic models, alternative investment models. And this is perhaps going slightly beyond LEPs, but thinking about shifting investment. Some of our Sustains members, some of the people we work with are now looking at how we can look actually to other investors and try to shift what they're investing in. And I think some of this discussion today has focused partly on how might we make sure that anything food related that a LEP funds is good. And I appreciate this huge can of worms about how we define good. So making sure it doesn't fund stuff that is perhaps destructive to the environment or our health, that doesn't fit with that bill. So there's that side of it. How do we make sure we don't fund bad stuff? But equally, how do we encourage some of the good ideas out there to kind of come forward and come to LEPs? Partly related to that, and this I think is where I've got a question for you, Jamie, but I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on it, is where LEP's roles in future, because they, as I think some of the speakers have pointed out, they are a little bit different from one another. How, what other sources of funding they might be pulling in beyond public funding? And I just wondering if that's something that as food partnerships we should be aware of and looking at, or is all of the LEP funding coming solely from those public funds?
So two questions there. In terms of the first part, we were working on something actually. So we realised for our Good Growth Fund, we've been investing in quite a lot of food businesses, and we had that exact concern, that we might not be investing in the right ones. So we were developing something as part of our sort of prospectus for bidders, which was a specific, I think we were calling it the Good Food Business Charter or something like that. So it was principles by which food businesses would need to adhere to. And actually, for the life of me, I can't remember whether it was actually implemented for the last round or not. So I'll dig it out if it was finalised. But that idea, I mean, we do something very similar actually as well for workspace, for example. So we're developing a workspace accreditation. So if we're funding a new co-working space, is it providing affordable space? Does it have community impact? There's lots of things different things you can measure. And the Mayor's also developed something called the Good Work Standard, which looks at employment as well. I know Claire, who's the chair of our London Food Board, she would always say the one thing you can do is to pay London living wage, and then everything else follows. But the Good Work Standard looks at that as a baseline, but then the other practices that you can do to support employees, and we will ideally invest in businesses that meet that criteria. In terms of the second question, Ben, around other funding, it's a good one. I mean, we've traditionally, LEPs have relied on match funding from local authorities in kind, and from ERDF. There are some that have some really good examples where they've leveraged private sector funding, but it's a really tricky one. I mean, every penny, let's say, it depends how you do it. So every penny that we give out through the Good Growth Fund has to be matched 50-50 pretty much. So we would always say that we get 50% private sector match, but it's done at a project level. It's not done in a way that, the industry would give £5 million towards our funding pots, and I'm not sure whether I'd want to be in that position either.
That's really, really interesting. And your first point about the Good Food Business Charter, that would be fascinating. I think I saw a very early draft of that through some of your colleagues in the London Food Board, but it sparks an idea that maybe that's something that we could go back to with Sustainable Food Places, and something that we could talk to the LEPS network about. Clearly, they wouldn't want to be embracing a charter that they didn't think or that they think would tie their hands too much around working with food businesses. Hopefully, from the guys on this call and the food partnerships out there, we can help to demonstrate that there are businesses out there, there are enterprises, there are people with ideas who can help to sort of fit that bill, and that it is achievable. So that sounds like a really good thing to kind of take forward from this.
Fab. Thanks, Ben. We are 3 minutes over time, so I think it's probably best to wrap up this webinar, but it's been really interesting, and I think all the attendees will agree that there's been so much information shared, which hopefully will help food partnerships and local authorities and beyond work to create a more sustainable local food economy. In terms of going forward, I will be sending everyone a link to this webinar and all the resources that were shared here. But if you want to keep the conversation going, do email me. I've dropped my email in the chat, and we will hopefully be hosting a series of webinars in the next few months on this agenda. So I will keep you all posted. But if not, then I'll thank all the panelists for your amazing talks, and I will hopefully see you all soon.